Welcome to accommodate this, and welcome to the first in a short series covering the history of disability benefits in the United States. With all the craziness going on with politics these days and the uncertainties that we currently face, it's easy to forget that we live in a time of privilege, enjoying rights that many generations before us either lived without or fought tirelessly for. Unfortunately, so many people do not know the history, and we're about to be forced to repeat it in order to reestablish the rights we're about to lose. As I record this video, President Trump, Elon Musk, and the far right are systematically eliminating our rights through executive orders, fraud, and political overreach. In this video series, I want to talk about some historic moments and origins of disability benefits in the United States to help paint a picture of how far we've come and some of what it took to establish our system of disability benefits, which are currently at risk of being eliminated. Sometimes the future we dream of seems so far away that it can feel like we may never attain it. My hope is that I can instill some pride in the work that came before us, despite knowing that there's so much work left to be done. This is an ongoing process that is slow moving, but it is worth the effort. I also hope to illustrate exactly how far we've come and what is currently at risk of being lost under the second Trump administration. And now that you know why we're here, let's get into the topic for this video. The History of Disability Benefits in the U.S., Part 1. This video covers 137 years of events leading to the creation of the NIH and Social Security. Unfortunately, obtaining rights for people with disabilities has taken a long time in this country. As you will see through this account, rights are often denied on the ground despite the loftiness of the laws that have been written. And it's up to all of us to make sure we are honoring the rights and dignity of others. We can see the biggest strides were made only after a lot of suffering and violence had taken place. So you'll see many benefits were designed during or shortly after wars. Like the combustion engine, it sometimes takes an explosion of fire and fumes to force the machine forward. And because of this, the evolution of disability benefits is intertwined with wars and other civil rights movements that dared to push the boundaries of freedom. Our story begins in 1798. I covered this in my video on health insurance basics, which you can watch here. So I'll run through it quickly in this video. Basically, the United States had already fought and won the American Revolutionary War 22 years earlier, and merchant mariners had become a crucial component of the economy, traveling across the ocean to trade with other countries and to provide a barrier of defense. Unfortunately, sailors would often fall ill while away from home, and in that time there was very limited access to medical care in port cities. So President John Adams passed the Act for the Relief of Sick and Disabled Seamen to fund the creation of marine hospitals along major port cities. This network of hospitals was known as the Marine Hospital Service, or MHS, which can be considered one of the first insurance plans in the country. One of the most surprising facts was that this program was funded with a 20-cent wage deduction coming out of the sailors' paychecks, which is just under $7 in today's monetary value. It's hard to imagine so much development coming from such a small amount of funding these days. It was amazing. This was part of a particularly peaceful time in our country's history. It would be another 14 years before another war broke out, the War of 1812, which launched a particularly war-heavy period. The War of 1812 ended in 1815, and a couple years later, in 1817, the Indian Wars began, which lasted 81 years, ending in 1898. Meanwhile, the U.S. also fought the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and so the country had a huge number of dead or injured soldiers, which had a real impact on their ability to provide for themselves and their families. In 1862, the government began paying pensions to veteran widows and orphans of the Civil War. And then the following year, President Abraham Lincoln delivered his Emancipation Proclamation speech, promoting the abolishment of slavery, even though the war continued for another 2 years. In 1866, only a year after the war ended, the Civil Rights Act was passed, which was the first time a law was written to prohibit discrimination in housing for former slaves. It was also the first time the concept of automatic citizenship was established for those born in this country. It's interesting because today we kind of take for granted the fact that being born here grants us automatic citizenship. That just wasn't a thing until the Civil Rights Act of 1866. In modern times, Trump recently signed an executive order to eliminate birthright citizenship. We narrowly missed this right being stripped away, thanks to the judges who have blocked the order. More about that later. In 1869, Swiss scientist Friedrich Michner first isolated the DNA molecule, inspiring a whole new area of study. And by this time, the Marine Hospital Service, or MHS, had existed for over 79 years, yet they'd already established several branches and sub-branches all over the country. But this network of hospitals didn't really have any unifying mechanism between them. So in 1871, they were all consolidated under the umbrella of the Public Health Service, or PHS. I will refer to Marine Hospital Service and Public Health Service interchangeably. They're pretty much the same thing. This consolidation under the Public Health Service helped to organize and standardize some of the policies that provided healthcare and insurance for veterans and their families. You're probably wondering, David, why are you talking so much about the military and slavery? Well, back then, injured military personnel were the biggest segment of the disabled population. All those soldiers who lost limbs, lost their hearing or their sight, or who could no longer provide for themselves or their families were what people thought of when they used the term disabled. And the rights of many American citizens were codified into law because of the civil rights movement started by slave emancipation. So stick with me, it is relevant, and you'll see it all come together soon. This brings us to 1875, just 100 years after the start of the American Revolutionary War. And this country was just starting to learn that despite laws against discrimination, people are generally going to find ways to resist equal rights. Selfishness, hatred, and bigotry run deep in this country, which is still an issue we struggle with today. Although African Americans had the right to citizenship and the right to equal housing, they were not welcomed in most public places. Segregation was in its prime because, despite the laws, the attitudes of the people had yet to change. After several civil rights violations against African Americans, the government passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, also known as the Enforcement Act or Force Act. The hope was that this would underscore the importance of treating African Americans equally, particularly when it came to the use of public accommodations, such as transportation and jury service. And here's where we see the use of accommodation entering the general vernacular. Unlike personal accommodation, public accommodations are about providing equal access to goods and services. And while African Americans were legal citizens on the personal level, they were being denied access to the goods and services they needed to thrive. Passage of the 1875 Civil Rights Act set the stage for future affirmative action laws that we enjoy today, which prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and more. But it still took a long time for people to accept this law, and there were a lot of setbacks to get in the way. The country experienced a lot of civil unrest and no real change in how African Americans were being treated. In response to public outcry, the Supreme Court ruled in 1883 that Congress did not have the power to prohibit discrimination in the private sector. Basically, they said people had a right to discriminate. Thus, they ended up overturning some of the provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which became the norm for more than 80 years. Meanwhile, as all of this infighting was going on, science was advancing. Louis Pasteur had patented his process of pasteurization to reduce the spread of fermentation diseases by applying heat in 1865, and by 1872, he had established the first laboratory-produced vaccine for fowl cholera in chickens. Then in 1885, he successfully developed a vaccine for rabies. So, in light of these and other medical advancements, the government was beginning to see the value in investing in this type of research. So in 1887, the Hygienic Laboratory was established to study bacteria. This lab became part of the Marine Hospital Service, now known as the Public Health Service. And this is a pattern we see repeating throughout history. As our understanding of human experiences expand, so do the rights afforded to marginalized groups of people. And in 1890, after so many wars and medical advancements, the Civil War pension was amended to include disabled veterans, regardless of how they became disabled. This was a huge step forward for disability rights, putting those with mental illnesses and physical disabilities on the same footing for the first time. And 8 years later, there was finally an end to the Indian Wars in 1898. But the Spanish-American War had already begun earlier the same year. And again, there was no shortage of wars, which meant no shortage of soldiers developing disabilities. At the turn of the century in 1901, the Division of Scientific Research was formed, which included the Hygienic Laboratory and other research offices of the Marine Hospital Service. Then in 1912, just 10 years after the Spanish-American War ended, the Marine Hospital Service was officially renamed to Public Health Service. This was a time when we were learning a lot about diseases, what caused them, how they develop, and how to treat them. And with that knowledge came the realization that mankind could weaponize these diseases, launching us into an era of biowarfare. And this is when the government became focused on preventing the introduction, transmission, and spread of communicable diseases from foreign countries. And to help with that effort, they established a special cancer investigations laboratory at Harvard Medical School, marking the beginning of partnerships with universities. And it couldn't have come at a better time because in 1914, World War I broke out. During that war, Germany had been found to repeatedly use biowarfare, such as anthrax and glanders, to repeatedly infect the livestock of Allied forces. So by the time the U.S. joined the war in 1917, we already had a good handle on these biological agents. While attempts were made to sabotage livestock in the USA and other Allied countries, it did not end up having any military consequences. And this is one of the few times we were prepared in advance to handle the challenges of a new type of warfare, and it gave us a huge advantage. The First World War ended the following year in 1918, which marked the beginning of a time of peace and prosperity. The Roaring Twenties were considered a golden age of significant social and economic change. Automobiles, electric lighting, the radio, and other significant inventions were gaining popularity and improving the lives of the middle class. People believed the stock market would continue to grow and grow, and they forgot about many of the difficulties of times past. Then in 1929, the stock market crashed, marking the beginning of the Great Depression. Millions of Americans lost their jobs, leading to a surplus of workers who relied on a system that they were now unable to contribute to. This put a huge strain on the system and led to rampant poverty across the country. And when people could no longer afford food or sanitation, sickness and disease ran rampant. In 1930, the Hygienic Laboratory, established to respond to outbreaks and other public health concerns, was expanded beyond hygiene-related issues. In an effort to secure more funding for medical research, they were renamed the National Institute of Health, or NIH. Then in 1933, significant progress toward disability rights finally started to see some movement. The country was still in the middle of the Great Depression, and while it was quite common to see people foraging for food in trash cans, the largest segment of the population that was impacted were the elderly and disabled, who didn't have the physical health to weather the course. Upon seeing three elderly women foraging for food, Dr. Francis E. Townsend decided enough was enough. He wrote a letter to the Long Beach Press Telegram proposing that every American aged 60 or older should be provided with a federal pension of $150, later increased to $200. In today's terms, that's between $3,600 and $4,900, not far off from some of the tax relief payments from the Bush era in the early 2000s. The difference with Townsend's idea was that it was more than simply providing financial support, but it also touched upon the issue of reducing the number of surplus workers. This idea quickly evolved into a national movement that put pressure on Congress to do something to help the aged and unemployed. This was the conception of what would become Social Security. In 1934, the country experienced major drought in several states, which led to a series of dust storms that cut through the entire Midwest. As if things couldn't get worse during the Great Depression, these storms resulted in failed crops, dead livestock, thousands of people losing their farms, and a huge increase of economic hardship, not to mention starvation and thirst. And these storms were some of the earliest and greatest man-made ecological disasters, and they lasted for about 6 years. They were called the Dust Bowl, and symbolized the hardships many people suffered during that time. That same year, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also a person with a disability himself, reached out to the Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, the first woman to hold a cabinet position in the United States. FDR asked her to chair a study group called the Committee on Economic Security, which was tasked to prepare Social Security legislation. Roosevelt believed social insurance for the elderly, unemployed, and a general national health insurance were all necessary components to restore economic stability after the Great Depression. These ideas, among others, were known as the New Deal, designed to pull the country out of the Great Depression. The committee's report recommended legislation to provide old age and unemployment benefits to aid dependent children and public health, and child and maternal health programs. Although the report did not recommend disability benefits, it did state that illness is one of the major causes of economic insecurity, and that 1/3 to 1/2 of all dependency can be traced to the economic effects of illness. The debates about enacting a disability program hinged on two issues: administrative difficulty of the disability determination, and potential costs of the program. This was influenced by the fact that private insurance companies at the time were experiencing losses for providing disability insurance for permanent and total disability. Although those insurance programs first started at the end of the 19th century, disability insurance grew significantly after World War I due to an expansion of the definition of disability, something many insurance companies would later regret. These policies left out important protections that disincentivized returning to work, which caused a strain on such programs during a time when disability claims increased dramatically. Then in 1935, hope finally appeared on the horizon. The government passed the Social Security Act of 1935. This act established the federal income tax, which was used to fund the Social Security program. At that time, the program only included old age insurance and unemployment benefits. However, many recognized the permanently disabled were the only major class of people needing protection that did not receive it under this act. And yet no other group was more completely dependent or in a more desperate economic situation. Next time, I'll discuss the volley of rights between the three branches of our government that occurred as the nation struggled to balance multiple wars, famine and poverty, human rights violations, and the ever-increasing need for disability rights. Until next time, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please comment, like, and subscribe to see more content like this, or click on the video here to continue watching.